Hillbrook Insane Asylum Patient File Update. Entry by Dr Quinton Quartermain. Patient number 712, Axel Breitling, also known as Piston Head. Guys, we're supposed to be making these people better, alright? Just giving them silly nicknames isn't helping. Anyway, I just finished my latest session with 712. I'm happy to report the patient is responding well to the new treatment. Progress is slow, but steady. I don't believe we're quite ready to reinstate his toy box privileges just yet. He still dismantles anything you put in front of him. And while I have already voiced this issue to Dr. Wickman himself, people are still blatantly disregarding it, so it bears repeating. Do not, under any circumstances, bring him anything with wheels on it. I know it's a hassle to move the carts without them, but believe me, it's necessary. Barry went in there last week with a cart and, well, that's why he's not in this week. I sometimes wonder why I bother. It would take more than the ramblings of one staff member to get this place back on track. The nicknames, the taunting, and the seemingly over-reliance on electroshock therapy to solve patients' problems is disgraceful. Granted, some of these psychotics are as bad as they say, and probably deserve it. But when it comes to patient number 712, one can't help but wonder, is what happened to him all his fault? The town of Greyfield isn't a great place to start even at the best of times. Let me start by saying you haven't heard of it. It's a tiny speck in the middle of nowhere. For most, it's a place you pass through on your way to somewhere more important, quickly forgetting about it once you leave. It's not a town many would choose to stick around in. Axel's father apparently agreed, since he ran off not long after he was born. After his wife died during childbirth, he had no interest in raising what killed her, as he so eloquently put it, instead dumping him on his brother Murphy. Not that Uncle Murphy made that much better of a parent. He was an angry, bitter man, liked to drink, always insisted that Axel got his act together and made something of himself, often threatening him with physical harm whenever he felt he was slacking off. Scared to talk about his home life, Axel kept to himself all the way through school, never opening up to anyone. No friends, no social outings, not even a passing hello to another kid in the corridor. A loner in its purest form. This made him an easy target, of course. Many saw him as some weirdo to be made fun of, and those who left him alone did so mostly out of not wanting to get involved. Axel's opinion of the other students was, as a result, pretty negative across the board. This distaste later festered into full-on hatred. It got to the point where he couldn't stand to be around other people at all. There was one exception, however. Mary Draper. The kindest, prettiest, most wonderful girl around. The way she looked at him with those bright green eyes. How she cared so deeply for those around her. Her calm, reassuring voice that made you feel safe and loved. She was everything he could ever want. In reality, Axel was barely a blip on Mary's radar. All she really did was help him off the floor one time when he was knocked down by someone he didn't see coming. The whole encounter lasted barely a minute. As far as she was concerned, any meaningful relationship between them began and ended in that moment. Not so much for Axel. The boy was head over heels in love and had been working up the courage to ask her out for ages at this point. But no matter how hard he tried, he could never quite do it. He needed an edge, something to prove he was worthy of her love. And lucky for him, Greyfield had a particular form of exclusivity. With most necessities always within walking distance, owning a car was considered a luxury. Having one meant you were someone important, nor that you were rich. Since Axel was neither, he had to get creative. Literally. Getting his license at 17, he took up an after-school job at a local junkyard. Pay was low, but that wasn't the main draw for him. He spent most days crushing wrecks and clearing up scrap iron, but now and then he would come across something nice and intact. He'd then take it to the garage at the back where he'd work on his true goal, building his own car. One might think such an undertaking would be far too ambitious, but Axel has a way with machines. A kind of mechanical savant, he seems to have a natural understanding of how the various components come apart and are put together. I once let him have a look at my watch. He had it in pieces in a matter of seconds. It's honestly kind of impressive. Clearly though, Axel didn't think it alone would impress Mary. He got unlucky and found the chassis of an old Camaro and began working from there. Wheels and parts for the dashboard and interior weren't too hard to come by. Getting the exact panels was next to impossible though. Had to settle for whatever metal he found laying around. Figured a decent paint job would cover up the welding marks. There was a dual purpose to this build. Axel wanted out. Out of Greyfield, out of this life. He'd grown weary of the taunts from his fellow students, and Uncle Murphy's constant pressuring for him to get a real career instead of wasting his life away working in some scrap heap had become more than a little grating. He wanted to just drive away and never look back. Maybe he could convince Mary to come with him. Just the two of them out on the open road. His idea of heaven. The build had taken him months. The shape was a touch wonky, but stable. He'd even incorporated a convertible roof rack. He knew that was never part of the original car's design, but it'd certainly draw attention away from other inconsistencies, like how the right headlight was actually from an old Metro and was in upside down. Besides, who doesn't love an open-top sports car? Unfortunately, someone else had clearly thought the same. One of the more wealthy students had just gotten his first car and managed to score a date with Mary. Through some mild stalking, Axel had worked out that one of her favourite movies was being played in a drive-in theatre the next town over, and that they were planning to head there that night. The good news was that his car was only one part away from completion. But it was a biggie. The engine. Everything from the brakes, the throttle linkage, even the battery he had found a decent model of. None were in excellent condition, but they did the job. A working engine would be asking too much of the junkyard, however. Then he remembered. Uncle Murphy's old pickup. He hadn't used the thing in years. He wouldn't notice if the engine was missing. And even if he eventually did, he and Mary would be long gone by then. At last, his masterpiece was finished. A hodgepodge it may have been, but when done up with some hot rod red paint, it didn't look half bad. And like all great creators, he decided to give it a name. Something sexy. He dubbed her Vanessa. The next stage of Axel's plan was simple. Sabotage his competitor's car so it wouldn't run. Then, casually walk by and offer Mary a ride. To his credit, it worked. A few minutes or so later, he was walking her to the garage, ready to unveil Vanessa. Sadly, a certain someone had beaten them both there. Uncle Murphy had noticed. He'd been growing suspicious of Axel. The late nights, never explaining where he went, him being less attentive with his studies. He knew something was up. And upon discovering what it was, he was furious. All that time spent, and for what? To impress a girl with this heap of garbage? He'd been drinking, the whiskey bottle still in his hand. And before you knew it, this verbal assault turned into a physical one as he took a swing at Axel, catching him in the shoulder with the glass bottle. Shoved to the garage floor, catching his head on the car's right wing mirror as he went down, Axel looked up in search of Mary. That supportive, warm face. She'd help him in this time of need. She didn't. She wasn't even there. She'd ran the moment she saw Murphy raise his hand. Axel was all alone now. No one to protect him. No one to save him from his uncle's wrath. Then, something peculiar happened. Suddenly, a small metal bearing came loose from the car's engine and shot out at Murphy, jamming itself into the right side of his forehead. And just like that, he was gone. We're still a little unclear as to how this happened. Much of what we know comes from an examination of the body and from Axel Breitling himself. What we know is that due to the engine not being a perfect fit, Axel had to cut a hole in the bonnet, leaving it exposed. Due to a description from a witness, we'll get to him in a moment, we know that the motor had a tendency to shake about violently. Forensics believe that this is what caused the bearing to come loose. Though that still leaves the question of why was the car running at the time? Best guess is that Murphy must have switched the car on earlier in a classic case of curiosity killed the cat. But as far as Axel was concerned, Vanessa had just saved his life. It might sound absurd, but such a reaction is quite understandable. When a human being is isolated for an extended period of time, even if it's by choice, they'll often become desperate for affection. Some sign, no matter how small, that somebody cares about them. They'll then latch on and rarely let go. That's what drew Axel to Mary in the first place. But in the absence of a fellow human being, this same desperation can be directed towards, say, an object, a vehicle, even buildings. Point is, to Axel, Vanessa just became the kindest, prettiest, most wonderful girl around. Speaking of Mary, she hadn't abandoned Axel. She'd gone to get the sheriff in hopes of saving him. But by the time they got to the garage, nobody was there. Axel was on the other side of town, chucking Murphy's corpse into the river. Once he disposed of the body, he hit the road. Didn't get far, mind you. He'd only just reached the next town when Vanessa started acting up. The engine job had been a tad rushed. Vanessa needed something better. She wanted something better. Axel could tell from the way she rumbled. And he had to do right by her. She had done right by him, after all. When he pulled over, thinking about how he was supposed to get a new engine without any money, Axel caught sight of quite the specimen. Curvaceous body, perky rear, a seductive, purring voice. And the guy driving it was quite the look of himself, frankly. That ride had nothing on his Vanessa, of course, but from its oversized exhaust to its amazing performance, he could tell it had exactly what his girl needed. Jason Phillips, accountant for a law firm. Decent wage, nice house, loving partner and kids. A man who has had it good so far, basically. So of course, the universe chose this night to remind him life is unfair. Work had gone long, he was now driving home in the dead of night. He had the winding back roads all to himself. Or so he thought. A pair of mismatched headlights flashed in his rearview mirror. He couldn't quite make out the vehicle, but he could tell it was following too close for his liking. Eventually, he decided to try and outrun it. His car was powerful enough, and with how it was struggling already, there was no way that vehicle would keep up. But moments before he would have pulled away, his pursuer swerved right off the road. One could just make out the driver being flung from his car door. Being the good person that he is, Mr. Phillips pulled over to go and see if he was alright. He was found the next morning, having taken a blow to the head, trapped in the boot of his car, its motor completely gutted. Vanessa was running more smoothly now, but it wasn't long before she was groaning again, and Axel was back on the search, this time for a new gearbox. This was how Mr. Breitling operated for the longest time, always on the move, always on the search for that next part for his beloved vehicle. His logic, it seemed, was that Mary must have left him because he didn't show proper gratitude for when she showed him kindness. So, if he kept serving Vanessa, kept her happy, she'd never leave him. To him, it was the perfect system. She gets them from place to place, keeping them out of trouble, gives him somewhere to sleep, and he cares for her needs in return. All the while, Vanessa was becoming something more. Her owner working on her around the clock. The once simple, crooked bodywork became overrun with newer, mismatching parts, a piecemeal of varying components. A bigger grille, grippier tires, larger bumpers, a taller back wing, all in the name of making her stronger, faster, better. One has to wonder who was driving who at this point. The investigation into Breitling's crimes was growing, but it was never treated with too much severity. After all, it wasn't like he was killing his victims. He later switched to using chloroform to avoid having to rough them up too much. Though injuring the more resistant victims was somewhat unavoidable. Worst case was probably Melissa Hood, a construction worker from Colorado, who was hospitalized with 14 broken bones. She got some good hits of her own in though too, so much so that Breitling ended up fleeing without her brake discs. Not bad. It was after this encounter, Axel decided he needed to change his strategy. The constant fights and fake crashes were taking their toll on him. Plus, having such a specific MO, he knew he'd have to switch up his tactics if he wanted to continue evading capture. He couldn't allow himself to be caught. After all, who would look after Vanessa if he was in prison? Axel therefore turned to less confrontational methods. The Angel Heights hill climb always draws in a crowd. Car enthusiasts from all over show to prove their machines have what it takes to conquer the treacherous cliffside roads. This year especially, as there were two major points of interest. One was a strange custom job that looked like a mashing together of different cars. Nobody knew whose it was, but it was something to look at. The other was semi-popular online driving personality Sergei Petrov, better known by his online handle of Rad Russian Racer, apparently, who was trying to beat the lap record. The star had been up around the hill 8 times that day with no success, and was convinced something was wrong with his car. Some of the drivers suggested he check out this guy offering free repair jobs. Claimed to be a trained mechanic, and while he didn't show any credentials, he seemed to know what he was doing. Sergei hit the climb one last time, his car moving faster than ever. Too fast, in fact, as when he approached turn 3, he found he couldn't stop. In his search for whatever new part he had been after while working on Sergei's racer, Axel had severed the brake line. Everyone watched in horror as the car careened straight off the cliffside. Sergei was killed pretty much instantly on impact, so at the very least he didn't suffer. Afraid I can't say the same for the 3 spectators his car landed on though. Suddenly, Axel Breitling wasn't some nameless carjacker. Nobody cares when a bunch of random innocents get hurt, but the second it happens to someone famous, everybody loses their minds. Axel himself was in shock. He never killed anyone before, never intended to. Sure, Vanessa had killed for him, but that was different. That was in self-defense. This was straight up homicide. And possibly vehicular side in his mind, I guess? I mean, he thinks Vanessa's alive. Does he think the same way for other cars? I'll have to bring that up in our next session. Anyway, back to the story. All eyes were on Axel. Plenty had seen him. Many would be able to ID him. Several were already calling the cops. They even had footage of him thanks to Sergei's film crew. Everything he built up, his simple life out on the road, was falling to pieces right in front of him. Panicking, Axel ran for the protective embrace of his beloved Vanessa and drove hard. I still remember seeing the police chase on the news. It was the first time Breitling's machine had been seen out in broad daylight, and it was a sight. A complete Frankensteining of car parts. If there was anything from the original base left at this point, you wouldn't be able to tell. They'd been drowned by the huge blockade-ploughing front bumper, the ridiculously tall spoiler, the 2-feet grille, the 4-foot wide wheels, of which he had added a third pair somehow, the towering twin-turbocharged V12 engine with its huge exhaust and the patchworking of panels that was its bodywork. It was like something out of the apocalypse. Vanessa was certainly looking beefy, but the same couldn't be said for the driver. He'd been on the run for days now, non-stop. He hadn't slept, he hadn't washed, he hadn't eaten. He looked like hell. The man simply wouldn't give up, not for anything. Ironically, it was this devotion which led to his downfall. He'd led police on a chase across half a state at this point, winding up in Detroit. With the car having been raised and the wheels being so big, it could pretty much climb straight over most smaller vehicles, so boxing him in was impossible. The police had to take an unconventional approach, having most of the squad cars herd him from behind, while one officer went for the city streets to try and head him off from the side, her SUV being the only thing big enough to even have a chance against that metal monster. Getting her chance when Breitling was slowed by an awkward corner, she rushed in and performed a pitting maneuver on its back wheel. The impact crushed her front bonnet, but it was enough to get Breitling to spin out, his car's rear axle, I get it, snapping in the process. As it turns out, that third set of wheels had been added by necessity. The sheer weight of all the modifications Axel had added required a major upgrade to the structure. Now without that upgrade, the entire back end was dragging across the ground. In a last-ditch attempt to escape, Axel pushed his creation to the limit, but this brought on a shower of sparks from the rear as it was forced along the road, igniting the gasoline leaking from his fuel tank. It burst into flames, soon engulfing the entire back of the car. The officer left her totaled SUV and tried to pull Breitling from the burning wreckage, but he held tight to the steering wheel with a strength that betrayed his gaunt appearance. "You've killed her! You've killed her!" he screamed. In the end, it took 4 additional officers to finally drag him from the wreck and restrain him. Axel could do nothing but scream out Vanessa's name as he watched her burn. Now, one might wonder how such an important component of the car could have been broken like that, especially given the surprisingly solid overall build quality. See, it had been badly damaged beforehand on some of the rockier terrain from the hill climb. In that instance, he managed to evade police, but then had to replace that section if he wanted to keep going. Problem was, he didn't have any spares, and after what happened earlier, he couldn't bring himself to put another person at risk by stealing it. He just needed something that could act as a long, thin support. So, he got desperate. Good thing Vanessa wasn't automatic. I'd imagine it'd be rather difficult to work the clutch when you've only got one leg. When Axel Breitling was first wheeled into Hillbrook, he looked absolutely destroyed. Never talking, just staring out into space with that expression of complete and utter misery. Though he has since entered a more positive state, it perhaps poses a far greater challenge for us. I think it was brought on after we first put him in that wheelchair. Side note, we're not ready to try the wheelchair again yet. Just stick to the crutches for now. In Axel's mind, Vanessa never died. He convinced himself that was all a terrible dream. From then on, he would just sit there in his cell, pretending he's still driving her. Even makes low engine noises and everything. That behaviour has persisted, though we have been making some breakthroughs recently. The delusion has evolved to incorporate the asylum and its staff. His room is now a garage where he tunes up Vanessa, which is really just the bed. To him, we're all visitors, neighbours, milkmen, people delivering new parts, and as Barry found out the hard way last week, fellow car enthusiasts looking for a race. How the hell he managed to pull off that sideswipe, I'll never know. I've been making good progress with Axel as of late. We're able to hold entire conversations now, so long as they don't interfere with the delusion he's built. The second the internal logic is brought into question, he'll stop listening, get in his car, and drive away. In this state, he ignores all outside influences, purely focusing on driving. Who knows? Maybe one of these days, he'll find the road back to reality. Or we'll just electrocute him again. That works too, I guess. Except it doesn't. Because he's still here. As is everyone else we electrocute. Just saying. End recording.